Ever wondered what French Nick Wilde would look like? Curious how German Nick Wilde would look. Can you picture South Korean Nick Wilde with a K-pop style? What would Vietnamese Nick Wilde look like enjoying pho? Ever thought about how British Nick Wilde would sip tea? Curious to see how Mexican Nick Wilde would celebrate. What would Irish Nick Wilde look like in a pub? Ever thought about how Italian Nick Wilde would blend in? How would Icelandic Nick Wilde enjoy the Northern Lights? Can you guess how Australian Nick Wilde would surf? Curious how Indonesian Nick Wilde would look. Imagine how Swedish Nick Wilde would appear. Wonder how Bangladeshi Nick Wilde would dress. Can you picture Argentine Nick Wilde in his native style? Curious how Polish Nick Wilde would enjoy a pierogi. Ever wondered what Russian Nick Wilde would look like in winter? Imagine how Qatari Nick Wilde would blend in at the souk. Curious to see how American Nick Wilde would celebrate the 4th of July.
USA, USA.
How would Turkish Nick Wilde enjoy a cup of gay? Can you guess how Thai Nick Wilde would celebrate Songkran? Ever imagined how Mongolian Nick Wilde would ride a horse? Wonder how Filipino Nick Wilde would enjoy a fiesta. Curious how Scottish Nick Wilde would wear a kilt. Ever wondered what New Zealand Nick Wilde would look like on a sheep farm? Imagine how Georgian Nick Wilde would celebrate with kakapuri. Wonder how Danish Nick Wilde would enjoy hide. Can you picture Algerian Nick Wilde with traditional dress? Curious to see how Pakistani Nick Wilde would celebrate Eid. Curious how Colombian Nick Wilde would dance. Ever imagined how Indian Nick Wilde would celebrate Diwali? What would Belgian Nick Wilde look like with waffles?
Dat je minder vriend, waar de waffles niet. chocolate.
Can you picture Dutch Nick Wilde cycling through the tulips? Curious how Czech Nick Wilde would enjoy a Pilsner. Curious how Jamaican Nick Wilde would enjoy reggae music. Ever imagined how Greek Nick Wilde would savor a moussaka? Wonder how Egyptian Nick Wilde would explore the pyramids. What would Ghanaian Nick Wilde look like at a festival? Can you picture Albanian Nick Wilde enjoying a traditional meal? Wonder how Spanish Nick Wilde would celebrate fiesta. Wonder how Japanese Nick Wilde would wear a kimono. What would Tanzanian Nick Wilde look like on a safari? Ever thought about how Saudi Arabian Nick Wilde would blend in at a soup? How would Portuguese Nick Wilde enjoy a pastel de nata? Can you guess how Norwegian Nick Wilde would embrace winter sports? Curious how Finnish Nick Wilde would relax in a sauna. Ever thought about how Canadian Nick Wilde would celebrate Canada Day?
Canada is a place.
Wonder how Iranian Nick Wilde would dress for Nowruz. Ever thought about how Brazilian Nick Wilde would join a carnival? How would Bosnian Nick Wilde enjoy a plate of javapi? Can you guess how Romanian Nick Wilde would dance the hora? Curious how Hungarian Nick Wilde would enjoy a bowl of goulash. Imagine how Peruvian Nick Wilde would enjoy ceviche. Wonder how Sri Lankan Nick Wilde would savor some spicy curry. Can you picture Ukrainian Nick Wilde celebrating with a borscht? What would Ethiopian Nick Wilde look like enjoying injera? Can you picture Croatian Nick Wilde at the beach enjoying sun and sea? Curious how Azerbaijani Nick Wilde would celebrate Nowruz. Ever thought about how Austrian Nick Wilde would enjoy a slice of Sachertorte? Ever imagined how Cuban Nick Wilde would celebrate with salsa music? Wonder how Lithuanian Nick Wilde would embrace a basketball game. Curious how Swiss Nick Wilde would enjoy chocolate and cheese. Ever wondered what Nigerian Nick Wilde would look like at a festival? curious to see how Chinese Nick Wilde would embrace the Lunar New Year. What would Bulgarian Nick Wilde look like in traditional attire? Wonder how Kazakh Nick Wilde would look at a traditional eagle hunting. What would Moroccan Nick Wilde look like in a bustling market? Can you picture Malaysian Nick Wilde enjoying a bowl of laksa?